The rain hammered against the windshield like bullets as Mike Cross sat motionless in his truck, staring at the empty bottle on the passenger seat. 3 years had passed since he turned in his badge, but the memories still hunted him with relentless precision. He was a man who once believed in justice, who dedicated 22 years to putting monsters behind bars, only to watch them walk free on technicalities while their victims remained buried. The system he swore to protect had become the very thing he despised. His calloused hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles white against the cold leather. The clock on the dashboard read 2:17 in the morning, but time had become meaningless in his world of insomnia and regret. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. Shadow sat in the back seat, his distinctive white-gray coat barely visible in the darkness. The 10-year-old German Shepherd's amber eyes never left his partner, watching with the kind of unwavering attention that only a former K-9 officer could maintain. Shadow had been Mike's partner for 8 years on the force, and when Mike walked away from everything, Shadow was the only thing he refused to leave behind. They had survived 3 shootouts together, tracked down 12 missing children, and stopped more criminals than Mike cared to count. But now, both of them were just shadows of their former selves, living in a cabin 30 miles outside of town, avoiding the world that had disappointed them so profoundly. Mike finally started the engine, the rumble breaking the oppressive silence. He had come into town for supplies, nothing more. The plan was simple: get what he needed, and disappear back into the woods where nobody asked questions and nobody expected anything from him. But as he pulled onto Main Street, something caught his eye. A woman was running, stumbling actually, her face twisted in panic as she looked behind her. Mike's instincts, the ones he thought were dead and buried, suddenly sparked to life. Shadow's ears perked up immediately, his body tensing as he sensed the shift in Mike's demeanor. The woman crashed into a streetlight, falling hard onto the wet pavement. Mike saw a man emerge from the shadows behind her, walking with the casual confidence of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. Every fiber of Mike's being told him to drive away. This wasn't his problem anymore. He had given up the right to care about other people's nightmares when he walked away from the badge. But his foot pressed on the brake instead of the accelerator, and the truck came to a stop. Shadow whined softly from the back seat, a sound Mike recognized as anticipation mixed with concern. The man grabbed the woman by her hair, yanking her to her feet. Mike could see her mouth moving, pleading, but the rain swallowed her words. The predator's free hand moved to his belt, and Mike saw the glint of metal. A knife. Without thinking, Mike threw open his door and stepped into the rain. Shadow was right behind him, moving with the practiced precision of a dog who had done this dance 1,000 times before. The cold rain felt like tiny needles against Mike's skin, but he barely noticed. His focus was entirely on the scene unfolding 30 feet in front of him. The man with the knife looked up, his eyes meeting Mike's for just a moment. There was something in that gaze that Mike recognized instantly, the empty stare of someone who had nothing left to lose. Mike had seen that look in the mirror every morning for 3 years. But there was a difference. This man had chosen to embrace the darkness, while Mike was still fighting to keep it at bay, even if he didn't always know why. Shadow positioned himself at Mike's left side, his muscular body coiled like a spring, ready to launch at the slightest command. The scar across his muzzle seemed more prominent in the harsh streetlight, a reminder of the last time they had faced down danger together. The man released the woman and took a step toward Mike, the knife held loosely at his side. He was smiling now, a twisted expression that suggested he welcomed the confrontation. Mike's training kicked in automatically, his body falling into a defensive stance without conscious thought. His right hand instinctively reached for where his service weapon used to be, finding only empty space. He hadn't carried a gun in 3 years, another part of his old life he had tried to leave behind. But he still had Shadow, and that was worth more than any weapon. The woman scrambled backward, her eyes wide with terror as she watched the two men face each other in the rain-soaked street. The attacker was young, maybe 25, with the kind of desperate energy that made him unpredictable and therefore dangerous. His clothes were soaked through, clinging to his thin frame, and Mike could see the track marks on his arms even from a distance. An addict looking for money, or revenge, or maybe just someone to hurt because the world had hurt him first. Mike had arrested hundreds of men like this during his career, and he knew how quickly situations like this could spiral into violence. The knife in the man's hand wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. Shadow's low growl cut through the sound of the rain, a warning that needed no translation. Mike raised his hand slowly, palms out, the universal gesture of peace. But his voice when he spoke carried none of that peaceful intention. It was the voice of a man who had spent 2 decades commanding respect in the worst situations imaginable. A voice that expected to be obeyed. "Come on, kid. You don't want to do this. Put the knife down and walk away. Nobody has to get hurt tonight." The words felt strange in his mouth, like a language he had forgotten how to speak. For 3 years, he had avoided confrontation, avoided responsibility, avoided anything that reminded him of the man he used to be. But standing here now, with an innocent woman's life hanging in the balance, he realized that some parts of who you are never truly die. They just wait for the right moment to resurface. The attacker laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that spoke of broken dreams and shattered minds. "You're nobody, old man. This ain't your business. Walk away while you still can." He took another step forward, and Mike could see the blade more clearly now. It was a folding knife, probably 4 inches long, nothing fancy, but more than enough to kill someone if used correctly. Mike had seen what knives like that could do to human flesh, had attended to many autopsies where the cause of death was listed as multiple stab wounds. The images flashed through his mind unbidden, unwanted reminders of why he had walked away from this life in the first place, but he didn't walk away. Instead, he took a step forward, closing the distance between them. Shadow moved with him, maintaining perfect position at his side. The woman had managed to get to her feet and was backing away slowly, her survival instinct telling her to put as much distance between herself and the knife as possible. Smart girl. Mike kept his eyes locked on the attacker, reading his body language, looking for the telltale signs that would indicate when he was about to strike. The tension in the shoulders, the shift in weight from one foot to the other, the slight adjustment of grip on the weapon. These were the things that kept you alive in situations like this, the small details that most people never noticed until it was too late. "I used to be like you," Mike said, his voice quieter now but no less intense. "I thought the world owed me something. I thought violence was the answer to every problem. But I'll tell you what I learned, kid. The only thing violence gets you is more violence, and eventually, you run out of people to hurt, and you're left with nothing but scars and regrets." He could feel the old pain rising in his chest, the memories of every case that went wrong, every victim he couldn't save, every criminal who walked free because the system was broken. It was like reopening a wound that had never fully healed, and the sting of it took his breath away for just a moment. The attacker's expression flickered, uncertainty crossing his face for just a second before the mask of aggression slammed back into place. "You don't know nothing about me. You don't know what I've been through." His voice cracked on the last word, and Mike saw the truth beneath the bravado. This wasn't a hardened criminal. This was a scared, desperate kid who had made bad choices and was now trapped in a situation that was spiraling out of his control. Mike had seen it 1,000 times before. The tragedy wasn't that people like this existed, it was that the system created them, and then punished them for being exactly what it had made them. "You're right," Mike admitted. "I don't know your story. But I know how this ends if you don't put that knife down. Either I take it from you, and you go to prison, or you use it, and you spend the rest of your life knowing you destroyed someone's family over nothing. Is that really how you want this to play out?" Shadow's growl intensified, a clear warning that the dog's patience was wearing thin. Mike could feel the tension in Shadow's body through the connection they shared, could sense that the German Shepherd was seconds away from making his own decision about how to handle the threat. And once Shadow decided to act, there would be no stopping him. The dog had been trained to neutralize threats with extreme prejudice, and 3 years of retirement hadn't dulled those instincts one bit. The standoff lasted another 5 seconds that felt like 5 hours. Then, finally, the knife clattered to the wet pavement. The attacker's shoulders sagged, all the fight draining out of him like air from a punctured tire. Mike moved quickly, kicking the knife away and positioning himself between the defeated young man and the woman who was now sobbing with relief. Shadow remained alert, his amber eyes tracking every movement, ready to intervene if the situation changed. Mike pulled out his phone and dialed 911, his voice steady as he reported the incident and requested police presence. The operator recognized his name immediately, and there was a moment of surprised silence before she confirmed units were on the way. Within minutes, 3 patrol cars arrived, their red and blue lights painting the rain-soaked street in alternating waves of color. Mike recognized 2 of the officers who emerged, former colleagues who had reached out after his retirement only to be met with silence. Detective Sarah Chen approached first, her expression a mixture of surprise and something that might have been relief. "Mike Cross," she said, and there was genuine warmth in her voice despite the circumstances. "I heard rumors you'd moved up into the mountains. Didn't think we'd see you back here. Especially not saving the day like some kind of vigilante superhero." She smiled when she said it, but Mike could see the concern in her eyes. The unspoken question about whether he was okay. "I'm not back," Mike replied, his tone making it clear this was a one-time occurrence. Just wrong place, wrong time. Or right place, right time, depending on how you look at it. He gave his statement quickly and efficiently, years of experience making the process almost automatic. The woman he had saved, her name was Jennifer Morrison, tried to thank him multiple times, her words tumbling over each other in a rush of gratitude and emotion. Mike accepted her thanks with a brief nod, but didn't engage beyond that. He didn't want her gratitude. He didn't want anything except to get back in his truck and return to the isolation he had carefully constructed over the past 3 years. But as he turned to leave, Detective Chen called out to him, "Mike, wait. There's something you should know." Her expression had shifted, becoming more serious, more cop and less old friend. "That guy you stopped tonight, his name is Tyler Brennan. He's connected to something bigger, something we've been investigating for the past 6 months. We think he's part of a human trafficking ring operating out of the old industrial district. We've been trying to build a case, but we keep hitting walls. Every time we get close, our leads go cold." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I know you walked away from this life, and I respect that. But if you have any interest in helping us take these people down, we could really use someone with your expertise." Mike felt something twist in his gut. Human trafficking. Of all the crimes he had dealt with during his career, those cases had always hit him the hardest. The victims were so often forgotten, written off as runaways or addicts, their suffering invisible to a society that didn't want to acknowledge their existence. He had worked 2 major trafficking cases in his career, and both had ended with partial victories at best. Some victims rescued, but never all of them. Never enough. The faces of the ones he couldn't save still haunted his dreams. Young girls and boys whose eyes held the kind of hopelessness that came from being treated as merchandise rather than human beings. Shadow pressed against Mike's leg, a gentle reminder of his presence. The dog's instincts were telling him something was wrong, that his partner was struggling with something internal and invisible. Mike reached down and scratched behind Shadow's ears, the familiar gesture grounding him in the present moment. He looked at Detective Chen, at the hope mixed with understanding in her expression, and he felt the walls he had built around himself beginning to crack. This is what happened when you let the world back in. It reminded you that there were still battles worth fighting, still people worth saving, still reasons to care even when caring hurt more than anything else. "I'll think about it," Mike finally said, and even as the words left his mouth, he knew he was lying. He was already thinking about it, already running scenarios in his head, analyzing patterns, considering approaches. The detective part of his brain that he thought he had successfully shut down was roaring back to life, demanding attention, refusing to be ignored. Chen seemed to recognize this, a knowing smile crossing her face. She handed him a card with her direct number written on the back. "Call me if you change your mind. No pressure, Mike. But we both know you're not the kind of man who can sit on the sidelines when innocent people are suffering." Mike took the card, shoving it into his pocket without looking at it. He whistled for Shadow and headed back to his truck, his mind already spinning with possibilities he didn't want to consider. The rain had lightened to a drizzle now, but the cold had intensified, seeping through his wet clothes and settling into his bones. He climbed into the driver's seat, and Shadow jumped into his usual spot in the back. For a long moment, Mike just sat there, his hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. The woman he had saved tonight, Jennifer Morrison, was safe because he had been in the right place at the right time. But how many others weren't safe? How many victims were out there right now, suffering in silence, waiting for someone to care enough to find them? The drive back to the cabin took 45 minutes, but Mike barely registered the passage of time. His mind was elsewhere, trapped in a maze of memories and moral obligations he thought he had left behind. Shadow remained quiet in the back seat, his intelligent eyes watching Mike through the rearview mirror. The dog knew something had changed. After 8 years as partners, Shadow could read Mike's moods better than any human ever could. And right now, Shadow could sense that the fragile peace they had found in their isolated existence was being threatened by something Mike couldn't simply walk away from. The cabin came into view just as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. It was a modest structure, built by Mike's own hands over the course of 2 years. No neighbors within 5 miles, no sounds except the wind through the trees and the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. This was supposed to be his sanctuary, the place where the world couldn't reach him, couldn't demand anything from him, couldn't disappoint him anymore. But as he killed the engine and sat in the growing light, Mike realized that sanctuary was just another word for prison when you used it to hide from who you really were. Shadow followed him inside, immediately heading to his water bowl and drinking deeply. Mike shed his wet clothes and toweled off, his movements automatic and mechanical. He made coffee, strong and black, and sat at the kitchen table with Detective Chen's card in front of him. The numbers on the card seemed to glow in the dim light, taunting him with possibilities he had sworn to reject. Human trafficking ring. How many victims? How many children being sold like property while he sat in his cabin in the woods, pretending the world's problems weren't his responsibility anymore? The coffee tasted like ash in his mouth. He thought about the cases that had broken him, the ones that had finally convinced him to turn in his badge and walk away. There was Maria Gonzalez, 8 years old, who had been taken by her own uncle and sold to a trafficking ring. They had found her 3 months later, alive, but destroyed in ways that no child should ever experience. The uncle got 7 years, reduced to 4 for good behavior. 4 years for destroying a little girl's life. Then there was the Thompson case, where they had raided a house and found 6 teenagers locked in the basement, being used for things Mike still couldn't think about without feeling sick. They arrested 14 men in connection with that case. 6 of them walked on technicalities. 3 more got plea deals that amounted to little more than a slap on the wrist. Was this justice? Was this what he had spent 22 years fighting for? Shadow appeared at Mike's side, resting his massive head on Mike's thigh. The dog's amber eyes held a question that needed no words to express. What are we going to do? Mike stroked Shadow's gray and white fur, feeling the scars beneath his fingertips. The German Shepherd had earned those scars protecting people, doing the job he was trained to do without question or hesitation. Shadow didn't understand concepts like burnout or disillusionment. He only understood loyalty, duty, and the clear distinction between right and wrong. Maybe that's what Mike had lost over the years, that clarity that allowed you to keep fighting even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Maybe that's what he needed to find again. The sun was fully up now, streaming through the cabin's windows and illuminating the simple space Mike had created for himself. There were no photographs on the walls, no mementos from his past life, nothing that would remind him of the years he spent as a detective. It was as if Mike Cross, the cop, had ceased to exist the moment he drove away from the precinct for the last time. But now, sitting here with Shadow at his side and a trafficking case pulling at him like a hook through his conscience, Mike realized that you couldn't erase who you were just by changing your location. The detective was still in there, buried beneath layers of disappointment and cynicism, but not dead. Not even close to dead. He picked up his phone and stared at Detective Chen's number for a long time. Shadow's tail began to wag slowly, as if the dog sensed what was coming and approved. Mike took a deep breath and made the call. Chen answered on the second ring, her voice alert despite the early hour. "This is Cross," Mike said, and heard her sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Tell me everything you know about this trafficking ring. And don't leave anything out, no matter how small or insignificant it might seem. I need to see the whole picture." There was a pause, and then Chen's voice came back, filled with an emotion Mike recognized as hope mixed with relief. "I'll have everything sent to you within the hour." "Thank you, Mike. You have no idea how much this means." Mike ended the call and set the phone down on the table. Shadow was standing now, his entire body vibrating with barely contained excitement. The dog knew what this meant. They were going back to work, back to hunting the kind of predators who deserved to be hunted, back to being the team they had been before everything fell apart. Mike reached down and ruffled Shadow's ears, feeling something he hadn't felt in 3 years slowly stirring in his chest. Purpose. Maybe even hope. "Are you ready for this, boy? Because once we start, we're seeing it through to the end, no matter where it leads or what it costs us." Shadow's response was a sharp bark of affirmation, and for the first time in a very long time, Mike Cross smiled. The files arrived exactly as promised, delivered electronically to the encrypted email address Mike hadn't used since his retirement. He spent the next 6 hours going through every detail, every witness statement, every piece of evidence that had been collected over the past 6 months. Shadow lay at his feet the entire time, occasionally lifting his head when Mike let out a frustrated grunt or muttered something under his breath. The picture that emerged from the files was both infuriating and disturbingly familiar. This wasn't some sophisticated international operation. It was local, organized by people who understood how to exploit the gaps in the system, who knew exactly which officials to bribe and which victims would never be missed. The ring's primary recruiter was a woman named Cassandra Vale, 42 years old, with a string of minor offenses on her record, but nothing that had ever stuck in a serious way. She operated out of a youth center in the industrial district, presenting herself as someone who helped troubled teens get back on their feet. In reality, She was identifying vulnerable kids. Kids with addiction problems or family issues or nowhere else to turn, and feeding them into a pipeline that ended in basements and shipping containers. The files included surveillance photos of Cassandra, and Mike studied her face carefully. She looked kind, almost maternal, with warm eyes and a gentle smile. The perfect predator's disguise. The enforcement arm of the operation was run by a man named Marcus Reed, 38, former military, with a dishonorable discharge for conduct unbecoming. Reed's job was simple: keep the victims compliant and deal with anyone who caused problems. The files included testimony from one victim who had managed to escape, a 17-year-old girl who described Reed as someone who enjoyed his work far too much. She had scars on her arms and back that corroborated her story, physical evidence that painted a picture of systematic brutality. Reed's last known address was an apartment complex near the docks, but surveillance teams had reported no activity there for the past 3 weeks. The money man was the real mystery. Someone was financing this operation, providing the resources to buy silence and purchase protection. The investigation had identified several shell companies and offshore accounts, but every trail went cold before reaching an actual name. Detective Chen had noted in her summary that she suspected the financier was someone with significant local influence, possibly someone in law enforcement or city government. That particular detail made Mike's stomach turn. The idea that one of his former colleagues or supervisors might be profiting from human suffering was almost too much to bear. Almost Mike closed his laptop and rubbed his eyes, feeling the familiar ache of exhaustion that came from too much information and too little sleep. Shadow was watching him intently, waiting for a signal, waiting for direction. Mike knew what he had to do next. Reading files was one thing, but real detective work happened in the streets, talking to people, following leads that might not even exist yet. He needed to go back into the city, back into the world he had tried so hard to leave behind. But this time would be different. This time, he wouldn't be bound by departmental politics or legal procedures that protected the guilty as often as they punished them. This time, he would do whatever it took to shut this operation down and save the victims who were still trapped in that hell. He called Detective Chen back. "I need addresses," Mike said without preamble. "I need to know where Cassandra Vale spends her time when she's not at the youth center. I need Marcus Reed's known associates and their locations. And I need access to the financial records you've collected on those shell companies." Chen hesitated before responding. "Mike, you're not an active detective anymore. I can share information with you as a confidential informant, but I can't give you everything. There are protocols I have to follow." Mike's voice hardened. "Sarah, I've read your files. I've seen your case notes. You've been spinning your wheels for 6 months because you're trying to do everything by the book. But the book was written by people who don't understand how operations like this work. You need someone who's willing to go off book, and we both know that's not something you can do without risking your career." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Chen spoke, and her voice was resigned but determined. "Give me 24 hours. I'll get you what you need. But Mike, promise me you won't do anything stupid. These people are dangerous, and you don't have the protection of a badge anymore. If something goes wrong, I can't save you." Mike appreciated her concern, but they both knew it was unnecessary. "I stopped worrying about saving myself 3 years ago, Sarah. But I'll worry about those kids they've got locked up somewhere. That's enough to keep me careful." He ended the call and looked down at Shadow. The dog's tail was wagging again, a clear sign that he understood they were on the scent of something worth pursuing. The next 24 hours passed with agonizing slowness. Mike used the time to prepare, going through his old equipment that he had stored in the cabin's attic. His tactical vest, his backup weapon, that he had purchased legally after retirement, his lock-picking kit, his surveillance gear, all the tools of a trade he thought he had abandoned forever. Shadow seemed to sense the shift in energy, becoming more alert and focused with each passing hour. The dog hadn't lost a step despite his age, his training and instincts as sharp as they had been during his prime years on the force. If anything, the years of rest had left him more ready than ever to get back to work. Detective Chen's package arrived exactly on schedule, delivered by a courier who didn't ask questions and didn't wait for a signature. Inside were copies of everything Mike had requested, plus a few things he hadn't. Financial records that showed a pattern of payments flowing from an LLC registered in Delaware to various individuals in the city. Photos of Cassandra Vale meeting with known criminals in locations she probably thought were safe. A list of properties owned by the shell companies, including 3 warehouses in the industrial district that had been flagged as possible holding locations. And, tucked into the bottom of the envelope, a handwritten note from Chen that read simply, "Be careful. Some of us still think you're one of the good ones." Mike spread everything across his kitchen table, creating a map of the operation in his mind. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. Vale recruited victims through her youth center, targeting kids who were already on society's margins. Reed provided muscle and intimidation, keeping the victims compliant and dealing with anyone who tried to interfere. The money man, still unidentified, provided the resources and protection necessary to keep the operation running smoothly. And somewhere in this city, right now, there were victims trapped in a nightmare they couldn't escape from. Kids who had already been failed by every system meant to protect them, now suffering in silence because nobody cared enough to look for them. Shadow's sudden bark pulled Mike out of his thoughts. The dog was standing at the window, his ears forward and his body tense. Mike moved quickly to join him, scanning the tree line that surrounded the cabin. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then, a flash of movement caught his eye. Someone was out there, moving through the trees with the kind of caution that suggested they didn't want to be seen. Mike's hand went instinctively to his weapon, his body falling into a defensive posture that 3 years of retirement hadn't erased. Who the hell had found him way out here? More importantly, why the figure emerged from the trees, hands raised in a gesture of peace. It was a woman, young, maybe early 20s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and clothes that had seen better days. She was limping slightly, favoring her left leg, and even from a distance, Mike could see she was exhausted. Shadow growled low in his throat, but Mike placed a calming hand on the dog's head. "Wait, boy. Let's see what this is about." He moved to the door, weapon drawn but held low, and called out to the approaching figure. "That's far enough. Tell me who you are and why you're on my property." His voice carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed, and the woman stopped immediately. "My name is Rachel Torres," she called back, her voice shaking with either cold or fear or both. "Detective Chen told me how to find you. She said you might be willing to help me. I'm sorry for just showing up like this, but I didn't know where else to go. They're looking for me, and if they find me, I'm dead." Mike studied her for a long moment, his detective's instincts analyzing every detail. Her body language suggested genuine fear, not deception. The way she kept glancing behind her indicated she was worried about being followed. And if Chen had sent her here, that meant this was connected to the trafficking case. He made a decision and lowered his weapon. "Come inside. Slowly. And keep your hands where I can see them." Rachel approached the cabin with obvious relief, and Mike noticed fresh bruises on her face as she got closer. Shadow remained alert, but didn't show aggression as she entered, which was a good sign. The dog's instincts about people were rarely wrong. Mike gestured to a chair at the kitchen table and Rachel practically collapsed into it. "Start from the beginning," Mike said, holstering his weapon but remaining standing. "Tell me everything." Rachel took a shaky breath and began to speak. "I was one of Cassandra's girls. She recruited me 6 months ago, told me she could get me into a program that would help me get my life together. I believed her because I wanted to believe someone actually gave a damn about me." Her story poured out in a rush. 6 months of horror, condensed into 10 minutes of painful testimony. Cassandra had taken her to what she said was a residential treatment facility, but it was actually a warehouse in the industrial district. There were 12 other girls there, all around Rachel's age, all trapped and terrified. Marcus Reed ran the operation with casual brutality, beating anyone who resisted and threatening worse for those who tried to escape. They were being prepared for sale, Rachel explained, her voice breaking on the words. Like livestock at auction. Men would come to look at us, to inspect us, and Reed would negotiate prices while we stood there like we were nothing. Like we weren't even human. 3 days ago, Rachel had seen her chance. A buyer had gotten drunk and sloppy, leaving a door unlocked when he stumbled out of the warehouse. Rachel had run, not stopping even when she heard Reed shouting behind her. She had spent the past 3 days hiding in abandoned buildings and moving only at night, terrified that Reed would find her and drag her back. Then yesterday, she had managed to get to a phone and called Detective Chen, who she knew from before her disappearance. Chen had told her about Mike, given her directions to the cabin, and promised that Mike was someone who could be trusted. "So here I am," Rachel finished. "And I know where they're keeping the other girls. I can take you there, but we have to move fast. Reed knows I escaped, and he's going to move the operation before anyone can find them." Mike felt that old familiar fire ignite in his chest. This was it. This was the break the case needed. But it also meant moving immediately. No time for proper planning or backup. He looked at Shadow, then back at Rachel. "Can you walk? I mean really walk, not just limp along. We might need to move fast once we're there." Rachel nodded, determination replacing the fear in her eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes. Those girls in there, they're my friends. We can't leave them to Reed and Cassandra." Mike made his decision. He pulled out his phone and called Detective Chen. "Sarah, Rachel Torres is here with me. She knows where the victims are being held. I'm going in tonight, and I need you to have units standing by. But Sarah, they have to stay back until I give the signal. If Reed sees police presence, he'll either move the victims or do something worse." Detective Chen's voice was tense but professional when she responded. "Mike, you're talking about conducting an unsanctioned operation. If something goes wrong, if anyone gets hurt, this could blow back on both of us in ways we can't control. I understand you want to help, but there are proper procedures." Mike cut her off. "Sarah, those procedures take time, and Rachel says Reed is already planning to move the victims. By the time you get warrants and approval for a raid, those girls will be gone. Vanished into a network we might never be able to trace. You know I'm right. We have one shot at this, and it has to be now." The silence that followed felt like it lasted forever. Finally, Chen spoke. "I'll have units positioned at a half-mile perimeter. Give me the location, and I'll coordinate from my end. But Mike, if this goes sideways, I never authorized any of this. Do you understand?" Mike understood perfectly. Chen was putting her career on the line by even agreeing to this much cooperation. He gave her the address Rachel had provided, then ended the call. The sun was setting now, darkness creeping across the landscape like a living thing. Perfect timing for what they needed to do. Mike gathered his equipment, checking everything twice. Tactical vest, weapon with 2 extra magazines, flashlight, zip ties for restraining suspects, first aid kit in case things went bad. Shadow watched these preparations with intense focus, his body practically vibrating with anticipation. The dog knew what was coming. He had been trained for this, lived for this. And Mike could see in those intelligent amber eyes that Shadow was ready. Rachel provided more details as they prepared to leave. The warehouse was isolated, surrounded by other abandoned buildings that had once been part of a thriving industrial complex. Reed and Cassandra had chosen the location carefully. No neighbors to hear screams, no random passers-by to notice suspicious activity. There were usually 3 guards on duty at night, all ex-military types that Reed had recruited through his connections. The victims were kept on the 2nd floor, in what used to be offices but had been converted into makeshift cells. Rachel drew a rough floor plan from memory, marking entrances and exits, guard positions, everything she could remember. Mike studied it carefully, formulating a plan that would minimize risk to the victims while neutralizing the threats. The drive to the industrial district took an hour, and Mike spent most of it going over the plan with Rachel. "You stay in the truck with Shadow until I've secured the location. Once I give the all clear, you can come in and help with the victims. They're going to be traumatized, scared, and they might not trust another stranger. But they know you, which means you're our best chance at keeping them calm while we get them out." Rachel agreed without hesitation. Shadow remained alert in the back seat, his eyes scanning the darkness outside the windows. The German Shepherd's instincts were telling him that danger was ahead, and Mike could see the dog preparing himself mentally for whatever they might encounter. They parked 3 blocks from the Target warehouse, close enough to move quickly, but far enough to avoid alerting the guards. Mike pulled on his tactical vest and checked his weapon one final time. Shadow jumped out of the truck and immediately moved to Mike's side, falling into the heel position without needing to be told. After 8 years as partners, their communication was almost telepathic. Mike didn't need to give verbal commands. Shadow read his body language, understood his intentions through subtle cues that would be invisible to anyone else. This was what made them such an effective team. They moved as one unit, each anticipating the other's actions with perfect synchronization. The approach to the warehouse was textbook tactical movement. Mike and Shadow stayed in the shadows, using abandoned vehicles and debris piles for cover as they advanced. Mike could see 2 guards outside the main entrance, both smoking cigarettes and talking in low voices. They looked bored, complacent, clearly not expecting any trouble. That was their first mistake. Mike circled around to the east side of the building, where Rachel had indicated there was a service entrance. The door was chained but not alarmed, and Mike made quick work of the lock with his picking tools. Shadow slipped through first, his keen nose already working to identify threats, and Mike followed close behind. The interior of the warehouse was a maze of corridors and rooms, dimly lit by emergency lighting that cast everything in shades of gray and shadow. Mike moved with practiced silence, his weapon held ready, Shadow matching his pace exactly. They cleared the first floor methodically, room by room, finding nothing but empty spaces and old equipment. The victims were upstairs, just as Rachel had said. Mike found the stairwell and paused at the bottom, listening. He could hear voices above, male voices engaged in casual conversation. Guards. At least 2, maybe 3. And somewhere beyond them, behind locked doors, the victims waited in darkness and fear. Mike signaled to Shadow and began climbing the stairs, his footsteps soundless on the metal steps. The voices grew louder as he approached the second-floor landing. He could make out words now. One guard was complaining about not getting paid enough for this kind of work. Another was laughing about something that happened earlier in the day. They sounded relaxed, confident, completely unprepared for what was about to happen. Mike reached the landing and took a moment to assess the situation. 3 guards, just as Rachel had estimated. 2 were sitting at a table playing cards, and the third was leaning against a wall, scrolling through his phone. None of them were wearing body armor. All of them had weapons, but the weapons were holstered or resting on the table, not immediately accessible. Mike made his decision and moved. Shadow was right there with him, the dog's training taking over completely. Mike's voice cut through the casual atmosphere like a gunshot. Nobody move. Hands where I can see them. Now. The guards froze, surprise written across their faces. For a critical moment, they didn't react, couldn't process what was happening. That moment was all Mike needed. He had his weapon trained on the closest guard, his stance solid and unwavering. Shadow had positioned himself to cover the other 2, his teeth bared in a display that left no room for misunderstanding. Try anything stupid, and my partner there will tear you apart before you can even think about reaching for a weapon. Do we have an understanding? The 3 guards raised their hands slowly, their eyes darting between Mike's steady aim and Shadow's intimidating presence. The one who had been scrolling through his phone let it drop to the floor, the screen shattering on impact. Smart move, Mike said, his voice cold and controlled. Now, one at a time, you're going to remove your weapons using only 2 fingers and slide them toward me. Start with you. He gestured with his weapon to the guard closest to him. The man complied, moving with exaggerated care to avoid giving Mike any reason to pull the trigger. His pistol skidded across the floor, and Mike kicked it behind him, out of reach. The other 2 guards followed suit, their weapons joining the first in a small pile at Mike's feet. Shadow never took his eyes off the guards. His low growl, a constant reminder of what would happen if any of them made a wrong move. Mike pulled out his zip ties and ordered the guards to lie face down on the floor, hands behind their backs. They obeyed without resistance, which was probably the smartest decision they had made all night. Mike secured each of them quickly and efficiently, then did a rapid check to make sure none of them had backup weapons hidden on their bodies. Once he was satisfied they were no longer a threat, he pulled out his phone and texted Detective Chen with a single word. Now. The cavalry was coming. It was time to get the victims out. The doors to the makeshift cells were locked with padlocks, but Mike made quick work of them with his picking tools. The first door swung open to reveal 3 young women huddled together in the darkness, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. It's okay, Mike said, keeping his voice gentle and non-threatening. My name is Mike Cross. I'm here to get you out. Rachel Torres is downstairs waiting for you. You're safe now. The women didn't move immediately, their trauma making them wary of trusting anyone. Mike understood. He holstered his weapon and stepped back, giving them space. Shadow moved forward instead, and something remarkable happened. The dog's entire demeanor shifted from intimidating guard to gentle protector. He approached the women slowly, his tail wagging, and allowed them to see that he meant no harm. One of the women reached out tentatively and touched Shadow's head. The German shepherd pressed into her hand, offering comfort in the most basic and pure way possible. It broke the spell of fear, and the women began to cry, relief washing over them in waves. Mike helped them to their feet and guided them toward the stairs. There are 5 more cells to clear, he told them. Go downstairs and find Rachel. She'll take care of you. Tell her I'm bringing the others down shortly. The women moved past him, some of them reaching out to touch his arm or Shadow's back as they went. A wordless gesture of gratitude that Mike felt in his chest like a physical weight. He moved to the next cell, then the next, repeating the process. Each time, Shadow worked his magic, using his presence to calm traumatized victims and help them trust that their nightmare was finally over. By the time Mike had opened the last door, he had freed 12 young women ranging in age from 16 to 23. 12 lives that had been stolen, treated as commodities, subjected to horrors that Mike could only imagine. And now, finally, they were free. He heard sirens in the distance, growing louder. Detective Chen and her units were arriving. Mike made one final sweep of the second floor to ensure he hadn't missed anyone, then headed downstairs with Shadow at his side. Rachel had gathered the victims together near the service entrance, speaking to them in low, soothing tones. When Mike appeared, she looked up and their eyes met. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried more weight than any elaborate speech could. Mike just nodded. He was already thinking about what came next. The guards he had restrained upstairs were small fish. Reed and Vale were the real targets, and they were still out there somewhere. Detective Chen burst through the main entrance with 6 officers behind her, weapons drawn and ready for action. She took in the scene quickly, her professional mask firmly in place, but Mike could see the relief in her eyes. "Are the victims secure?" "All 12 accounted for." Mike gestured toward Rachel and the group. 3 suspects restrained on the second floor. "We need medical teams for trauma assessment." Chen immediately started issuing orders, her team moving with practiced efficiency to secure the scene and care for the victims. Paramedics arrived minutes later, setting up a triage area and beginning their evaluations. Mike watched from the shadows, feeling the familiar mix of satisfaction and emptiness that always followed operations like this. They had saved these 12, but how many others were still out there? How many victims would never be found? How many predators would escape justice because the system was designed to protect the powerful more than the powerless? Shadow pressed against his leg, sensing his partner's dark thoughts. Mike reached down and scratched behind the dog's ears, grounding himself in the present moment. Detective Chen approached him once the immediate chaos had settled. "We got them, Mike. 12 victims rescued, 3 perpetrators in custody. That's a win by any measure." But Mike was shaking his head. "This isn't over, Sarah. Reed and Vale are still out there, and so is the money behind this operation. Those 3 upstairs are just hired help." The next 48 hours were a blur of media coverage and official statements. The rescue of 12 trafficking victims made headlines across the state, with Detective Chen taking point on the public-facing aspects of the investigation. She praised the coordinated efforts of multiple agencies, carefully omitting any mention of Mike's involvement. The 3 guards arrested at the warehouse were arraigned on numerous charges. But as Mike had predicted, they claimed to know nothing about the larger operation. They were just hired muscle, paid to watch prisoners and keep their mouths shut. Reed and Vale had vanished completely, no activity on their credit cards or social media accounts, no sightings reported by any of the usual informants. Mike spent those days at his cabin, poring over the files again, looking for patterns he might have missed. Shadow remained his constant companion, sensing that his partner was in full investigative mode. The dog seemed content to simply be present, offering silent support while Mike worked through the maze of information. Rachel had been placed in protective custody and was cooperating fully with the official investigation, but Mike knew her information had limits. She could describe the operation from a victim's perspective, but she had never been privy to the details of how it was run, or who was really pulling the strings. On the 3rd day after the raid, Mike's burner phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize, and he almost didn't answer. But something made him pick up, some instinct that told him this call was important. The voice on the other end was male, older, with a kind of refined accent that suggested education and privilege. "Mr. Cross, I believe we have some matters to discuss. You've been quite troublesome, interfering with certain business arrangements that don't concern you." Mike's grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" The voice chuckled, a sound devoid of genuine humor. "Let's just say, I'm someone with a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. Someone who has invested considerable resources into an operation that you've significantly disrupted." Mike felt his blood run cold. not with fear but with rage. This was him. The money behind the operation. The person who had turned human beings into commodities and profited from their suffering. "You're making a mistake calling me," Mike said, his voice deadly calm. "Because now I know you're worried. You're worried that I'm going to find you, and you're absolutely right to be worried. I'm coming for you. And when I find you, you're going to answer for every life you've destroyed." The voice on the other end lost some of its smooth confidence. "You're not a cop anymore, Mr. Cross. You have no authority, no resources, no legal standing to pursue this investigation." Mike smiled, a hard, dangerous expression that Shadow recognized immediately. The dog's ears went flat against his head, his body tensing. "You're right about one thing. I'm not bound by the law anymore. Which means I can do things the police can't. I can go places they can't go. I can use methods they can't use. So please, keep thinking of me as just a bitter old man. It'll make it that much easier when I take you down." He ended the call and immediately contacted Detective Chen, relaying the conversation word for word. She listened in silence, and when he finished, her voice was grim. "He called you directly. That means he's either incredibly confident or incredibly desperate." Detective Chen was quiet for a long moment. "There's something I haven't told you. 2 days ago, I was approached by Captain Morrison. He asked me detailed questions about the raid, wanted to know how we got the intelligence that led us to the warehouse. I gave him the official story, said it came from an anonymous tip. But Mike, he was pushing hard. Harder than the situation warranted." Mike felt pieces clicking into place. Morrison. Captain Jonathan Morrison had been on the force for 30 years, well respected, considered one of the good ones. But Mike remembered something from his own time on the force. Rumors that Morrison had financial problems, a divorce that had nearly bankrupted him, gambling debts that seemed to disappear overnight. "We need proof," Mike said. "If Morrison is the leak, we need solid evidence before we can move against him. Going after a captain with nothing but suspicion will end badly for everyone." Chen agreed. "What do you propose?" Mike had been thinking about this since the phone call. "Morrison doesn't know that you suspect him. Use that. Feed him false information, something specific that he would have to pass along if he's really working with them. Then we set up surveillance and see who he contacts. If he leads us to Reed or Vale, we've got our connection." Chen considered the plan. "It's risky. If Morrison is innocent and finds out we were investigating him, my career is over." That evening, Detective Chen implemented the plan. She approached Captain Morrison with what she described as a major break in the case. A confidential informant had come forward, someone with direct knowledge of the trafficking operation's financial structure. This informant was scheduled to meet with Chen in 3 days at a specific location. She made sure Morrison understood the importance of keeping this information confidential. Morrison had nodded gravely, assured her that the information would go no further, and immediately retreated to his office. Chen had positioned a surveillance camera in the corridor outside Morrison's office earlier that day. The feed went directly to her personal tablet. She watched as he made a phone call exactly 17 minutes after their conversation. The call lasted 4 minutes. With Morrison doing most of the talking, the 3 days passed with agonizing slowness. Mike spent the time preparing for what he knew would be the final confrontation. He checked and rechecked his equipment, ran through tactical scenarios with Shadow, and coordinated with Detective Chen on every detail of the plan. They would have plainclothes officers positioned around the warehouse, ready to move in when the targets arrived. Chen would maintain command from a mobile unit 2 blocks away. Mike and Shadow would be inside the warehouse, the bait that would draw Reed, Vale, and anyone else involved into a trap they wouldn't see coming. The night of the meeting arrived with a cold wind that cut through even the heaviest jacket. Mike positioned himself inside the warehouse, finding a vantage point that gave him clear sight lines to all three entrances. Shadow settled beside him, the dogs breathing slow and steady. They waited in silence as the hours ticked by. At 11:15, the first vehicle arrived. It was an unmarked van, and Mike recognized Marcus Reed immediately when he stepped out. Reed was accompanied by two other men, both armed, both moving with the kind of practiced caution that suggested military training. Mike remained perfectly still, watching as Reed and his men swept the first floor. They were professional, methodical, taking their time to ensure they weren't walking into an ambush. But they were looking for police officers and standard tactical setups. They weren't looking for a lone detective and a K-9 positioned in the shadows of the second floor. Reed finally seemed satisfied that the warehouse was empty and pulled out his phone, making a call. 20 seconds later, a second vehicle arrived. This time, it was a luxury sedan. Cassandra Vale emerged from the back seat, followed by a man Mike didn't immediately recognize. But as the man moved into the light, Mike felt his world tilt. It was Captain Jonathan Morrison. Mike's jaw clenched as he watched the trio converge in the center of the warehouse floor. Their voices carried in the empty space. Vale was speaking, her voice sharp with frustration. "This is a disaster. We've lost the warehouse, lost 12 units of inventory, and now we have some retired cop playing vigilante." Reed's response was cold. "Then we eliminate the problem. Cross and his dog disappear, and the investigation loses its momentum." Morrison objected weakly. That wasn't part of the deal. Nobody said anything about killing a former detective. Vale rounded on him viciously. "You don't get to develop a conscience now, Captain. You've been taking our money for 3 years." The final vehicle arrived, and Mike's attention sharpened. This would be the person behind everything. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out, and Mike recognized him immediately. It was City Councilman Richard Ashford, a local politician known for his advocacy work with at-risk youth. The hypocrisy was staggering. Ashford used his position to identify vulnerable populations, then exploited them through the very programs meant to help them. It was evil dressed up as charity. Mike signaled to Detective Chen through his radio. Then he stood up, shadow rising smoothly beside him. "This is over, Ashford. All of you. Hands where I can see them." Reed reacted first, going for his weapon, but Shadow was faster. The German Shepherd launched himself over the railing, hitting Reed square in the chest and driving him to the ground. The other two armed men tried to draw their weapons, but Mike's shots, carefully aimed to wound rather than kill, dropped both of them. Vale screamed and tried to run, but plainclothes officers were pouring in through all 3 entrances now. It was over in less than 30 seconds. Mike descended the stairs slowly, his weapon trained on Ashford, who stood frozen with his hands raised. Captain Morrison had dropped to his knees, crying. Detective Chen approached Morrison first, her expression a mixture of anger and disappointment. "Jonathan Morrison, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit human trafficking, and about a dozen other charges." As officers moved to secure all the suspects, Chen turned to Mike. "We got them. All of them. The whole network." Mike should have felt triumphant. They had saved 12 victims, arrested 6 criminals, including a city councilman and a police captain. But all he felt was tired. Shadow returned to Mike's side. Mike checked the dog carefully for injuries, found none, and allowed himself a moment of relief. Detective Chen approached him as the suspects were being loaded into transport vehicles. "Mike, I don't know how to thank you. Without your help, these people would still be operating." Mike shook his head. "I didn't come back, Sarah. I just finished what you started. Tomorrow, I'm going back to my cabin." Chen looked at him for a long moment, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a business card. "This is for a therapist who specializes in working with former law enforcement. Maybe you should give her a call." Mike took the card without looking at it. Rachel Torres appeared, escorted by a victim advocate. She saw Mike and walked over. "Because of you, my friends are safe. Because of you, we all get a second chance." The drive back to the cabin took place in silence. Shadow slept in the back seat, exhausted. Mike drove on autopilot, his mind replaying the events. When he finally pulled up to the cabin, the sun was rising over the mountains. Shadow stirred, stretching as they got out of the truck. Mike stood there for a moment, looking at his sanctuary, and realized something had changed. He couldn't hide here anymore. The world had found him again, reminded him that there were still battles worth fighting. He pulled out his phone and looked at the business card. Dr. Sarah Kimmel, licensed therapist. Maybe it was time to admit he needed help. Shadow pressed against his leg, and Mike reached down to scratch behind the dog's ears. At least he wasn't alone. He had Shadow, a partner who had stood by him through everything. Together, maybe they could find a way forward. Not back to the job he had left behind, but toward something new. Mike looked at his faithful companion and smiled. "Come on, boy. Let's go home. We've got a lot to figure out, but we'll do it together. Just like always."